Our mindset in the 1980s was a determination to get information out, to cover exactly what they didn't want us to cover, but to try and outsmart them, to work closely with lawyers to find ways in which to convey information. Well, I was an editor under Apartheid, so I felt the harsh brunt of censorship very keenly in the 1980s. There were two stages to the changes, I think. The first was the day Nelson Mandela was released, because there had been a state of emergency with very severe restrictions on our media and our journalism. That fell away. Effectively, there were no rules the day he came out. 1994 introduced the Constitution, a new set of rules that both enabled and protected the media and the work of journalists. So there's no question that we work in a very, very different world that changed very quickly. We had to relearn our journalism to operate under a constitutional democracy. But there's no doubt that we've had, since then, a healthy level of debate, flow of information, and a much improved situation. Not that there aren't issues and problems, but it's very difficult to compare pre-1990 to post-1994. So certainly they tried to suppress and control the flow of information. They did directly through the SABC, which is our biggest media outlet. But there were elements of the media that certainly in the latter years consistently worked to undermine, challenge censorship and get information out despite those restrictions. So there was a battle over the flow of information in that period. And we had to develop approaches and techniques and a journalism that engaged in that battle to get the flow of information out. Just for example, there was a very tight control of reporting on security force activities. It was very broad, it was very general. And it was because we lived under a state of emergency and the security forces were getting up to no good and they were attempting to suppress that. But for example, we would report an incident without identifying that the perpetrators were security forces. And that would be in the grey area of the law. And our readers learned to know that if we said that an unidentified group of men attacked a crowd of protesters, they knew very well who we were talking about. Now, the state would then push back, change the regulations, tighten the regulations, or simply seize and ban our newspaper. But there was a constant tug of war with us pushing to get more information out and the state trying to keep control of it. Our mindset in the 1980s was a determination to get information out, to cover exactly what they didn't want us to cover, but to try and outsmart them, to work closely with lawyers to find ways in which to convey information, sometimes subtly, sometimes by using very particular language that our readers could interpret, and trying constantly to think of new ways to tell as much of the story as we could, and where we couldn't, to send it outside of the country to be used overseas. Yes. I would say there were three groupings if one looks at one's attitude to censorship and control of the media in the 1980s. SABC was directly controlled by the government, so it was the voice of the ruling party. The Afrikaans press, by and large, were with the ruling party, although some of the Afrikaans press was pushing for reform and change. The English press, I would say, was divided between those who had learned to live with the censorship and taken it on board, and what we call the alternative press or the alternative media, which actively worked to get that information out and undermine censorship. I generalized about the Afrikaans press, but of course there was one exception in the latter years, Vrye Weekblad, which is part of that alternative media which worked determinedly to break censorship.